Welcome back to the Joe Miller Show, KOA on Hot Talk, 1080 AM, 95.1 FM. This show is made possible by the McPherson Tax Defense Group, 1-800-BEAT-IRS, beatirs.com. That's B-E-A-T IRS, serving Alaskans, Americans since 1978 with 2 generations of tax defense attorneys. We have online my friend Dr. John Zmirak, contributing senior editor at the stream.org, received his B.A. from Yale University in 86, M.F.A. in screenwriting and fiction, and Ph.D. in English in 96 from Louisiana State University. Been involved in politics, a prolific writer, been a press secretary to a pro-life governor, and always fun to have him on the air. Dr. Zmirak, thanks for joining us again.
Thank you.
So you wrote a recent article on Ben Carson. Ben Carson, of course, under fire for the comments he made in the wake of the Oregon shootings. It's died down a little bit, but basically saying, hey, look, they should have fought back. And then, of course, the press sticking on this because even though Ben, I think I've said this before on the air, I think he's a little bit naive when it comes to real politics. He's not an establishment candidate, and the establishment, as he grows in the polling, is going to continue the attacks. This is one of the things they think is a weak spot for him. So he kind of doubled down and made a comment on the Nazis. And Dr. Zmirak, why don't you tell us what he said, whether or not you think that there is a net positive, kind of from the popular perspective of his comments, and whether he is right or not.
Well, let me speak to history, okay? I helped promote a book by Stephen Halbrook, a historian of World War II. He wrote a book called Gun Control in the Third Reich, and he just settles the question. It is absolutely settled history that the Nazis were obsessed with gun control, that they were haunted by the thought that Jews might have guns. And in fact, in the build-up to Kristallnacht, which was the horrible national pogrom conducted where they smashed Jewish store windows and burned down historic synagogues and beat and killed people and sent them to concentration camps, in the months and weeks building up to Kristallnacht, you know what the Nazis were preoccupied with? Making sure that the Jews didn't have any guns. And in fact, the problem was that the previous regime, the Democratic Weimar Republic, had a very strict system of gun registration. They were hoping to disarm the communist militias, the Nazi militias, and bring peace because there was a state of virtual civil war in the streets in the Weimar Republic. But of course, the people in communist fighting squads and in the Nazi stormtroopers did not comply with the law and register their guns. You know who did? Law-abiding Jewish citizens, law-abiding Catholic citizens, Protestant citizens. People, the kind of people who obey the law are the kind of people who gun control takes guns away from. Who doesn't it take it away from? Lawless thugs like the Nazis and the communists. So when Kristallnacht happened, sure enough, not a single Jew in Germany had a gun to defend his property against the mob attacks, and hundreds of Jews were killed, millions of dollars worth of property was destroyed or stolen, and the Nazis were able to impose a totalitarian government in part because none of the citizens had the wherewithal to resist. And if you go further, and if you look after the Nazi conquest of various countries, Poland, a lot of private citizens had guns. A lot of them had leftover military guns. There were serious resistance movements. There were resistance armies formed in Poland, including Jewish militias who rose up in the famous Warsaw Ghetto. That was because Poland had not confiscated all its citizens' guns. In France, by contrast, most citizens did not have guns, and in fact, when the Nazis came in, they let people know they had 24 hours to turn in their weapons on penalty of death. So the only people who could fight in the resistance in France were the communists who had underground caches of military-grade weapons. In the article, I go through all the countries where there was serious resistance to German occupation. And in every case, you see it was citizens who had private firearms.
So, and there's virtually none of that in Germany, right? I mean, Germany had a little bit of resistance, but it was just very minuscule compared to these other countries.
It was trivial. So you can track one of the, not the only, but one of the main factors determining whether there was resistance in a country was whether the citizens had weapons. In the occupied parts of the Soviet Union, especially Ukraine and Belarus, they had a lot of leftover military weapons from the war, and you had serious partisan armies that bogged down the German army. The same thing in Yugoslavia. So I think it's a matter of settled historical record that the Nazis were dedicated to gun control, and that wherever they did not have the chance to disarm the citizenry, the citizens had the opportunity to resist. That's settled history.
Back to candidate Ben Carson. What was it that he said that set people off so much on that issue?
He said that if the Jews had had weapons, they would have been able to resist the Holocaust. And that's historical fact, that we have evidence where the Jews had weapons. For instance, in Poland, they did resist the Holocaust. So people actually accused him of anti-Semitism for saying that. But
are there any Jewish?
That's ridiculous.
Any Jewish groups attacking him on that?
I think the ACLU. I haven't tracked it. It was individual commentators, most of them not Jewish themselves, accusing him of anti-Semitism. But if you read Jewish historians writing about the Holocaust, they bemoan the fact that they had been reduced to helplessness by being disarmed. They talk about how horrible it was, how many Jews were passively herded into the camps because they didn't have the wherewithal to resist. They were unarmed. Where Jews were armed, Jews defended themselves. And one of the big things in the founding of the State of Israel was, we will never again be passive, disarmed victims. That's what the phrase never again really refers to. And there are Jewish gun-owning groups in America who speak up for that quite vividly. But
you've seen the reports out of Jerusalem now. I mean, with all of the Arab on Jew attacks that have taken place, the Jewish government has said, look, everybody that can own a gun should have a gun on their person to defend against these attacks. I thought about that as I read your article.
Right. And think about this. We're flooding Europe with Muslims, and European countries are mostly disarmed. Those populations, the native populations of countries like Denmark and Sweden and Great Britain and France, are soon going to be victims of the same kind of organized Muslim violence that you see in Jerusalem. So you're going to see moves to bring back private firearms in those countries so that people can defend themselves against Muslim thugs.
And that's really the only answer they've got right now in Israel. It's like it's so ubiquitous, this violence, that unless the people on the ground, the citizens, have the ability to stop it, it's going to continue to claim victims. And so you're exactly right. And that is kind of on the ground as well. People say, man, I've got to start carrying my gun again. The interviews that they had with people in Jerusalem, and that's the first thought. And that's also the reaction that was had in Oregon. I mean, gun ownership goes up. People concerned about safety, they go and buy a gun. I mean, it's a fundamental right to be able to protect yourself, and you want to do it most effectively. And a gun obviously provides that.
Really, it's two different visions of what human beings are. Are we free, independent images of God who are responsible for protecting and supporting our own families, or are we veal calves dependent on the government to feed our families, to tell us how to raise our kids, and then to come and tag our bodies when criminals have killed us? Those are the two. That's the conservative versus the liberal vision of what human beings are. And the American historical vision of a citizen is an armed citizen, and there's a reason for that. The British Bill of Rights, enacted in Parliament, I think in 1689, was a response to the British Civil War, in which Protestants had been disarmed, and the Catholics and the Anglicans working for the king had been able to terrorize them. So the British Bill of Rights in 1689 included the right of gun ownership. That's where we got our Second Amendment. And that is why the United States was able to be formed, because our citizens were armed and were able to fight back against the British. In fact, there's no historical example of a country with a widely armed citizenry where a totalitarian government came to power except by foreign conquest or civil war.
It's interesting because a lot of people point at these mass shootings and they say, oh, this is another opportunity for the gun control advocates to make up ground, to actually get more restrictions passed. But the reality of it is when government demonstrates its inability to protect, which of course it can't do, it creates the precisely opposite reaction. Now, some countries, though, that's not the case. Like take, for example, Australia, with the mass murders that took place, 30, 25 years ago. It's all a blur. And, of course, they impose their massive gun control scheme that now prohibits you from having semi-automatics. Every gun's got to be registered, et cetera. The people in that country, of course, did not have the same tradition we have.
That's right. That's right. They were not a country that fought for its independence from its mother country. They're a country which was granted its independence slowly and reluctantly by the mother country. Now, they have a great military tradition. They have a lot of Australian military heroes, but they don't have the same political history that we do.
Right. Israel, of course, has more of an analogous history to us in the sense that it is by the might of arms that they've been able to survive, and they've, of course, been constantly under the gun, victims of military overt aggressive action, and so it's created a different mentality, especially with the Holocaust, than what you might see in some of these other Western countries. I mean, Europe likely, though, in the face of additional Islamic violence. I mean, it's probably your take that the people there are unlikely to start suggesting that they should have increased firearms rights. Instead, they'll probably look to government for some sort of solution, right?
Well, yeah, but if the government fails, if they don't deport these millions of Muslim immigrants someday, the individual people are going to have to take arms. And I'm afraid that we're looking at an inevitable civil war in Europe when the Muslims finally try to take political power and the remaining non-Muslims fight back. I'm not optimistic about the future of Europe.
Dr. Zmirak, we're going to talk more with you next segment about the ongoing candidacies for the Republican nomination for president. Stay with us. Joe Miller Show. Be right back. Welcome back to the Joe Miller Show, KOAN Hot Talk, 1080 AM, 95.1 FM. We have Dr. John Zmirak still with us. He's an editor with thestream.org, active in writing, former press secretary to a conservative governor, and always engaged and articulate on issues that matter to conservatives. Dr. Zmirak, we promised our listeners that we talk a little bit about this forum that you attended in Texas with the candidates for the presidency, the Republican nomination. Tell us a little bit about that forum, who was there, and who you think came out on top.
Well, it was a forum of the Christian right explicitly. It was at a really great mega church, Prestonwood Baptist Church in Plano, Texas. A really thriving, wonderful Christian community. And not all the candidates were there, but the ones who were there gave interesting talks. I did not hear Jeb Bush's talk because it came at the end. I needed to go to church, ironically, so I had to leave. But I heard Ben Carson, and he was impressive. He's not as powerful in person as he is in front of a camera. He's not as comfortable on a stage as some of the other candidates. Carly Fiorina was very smooth and very polished and very appealing. I think she is more of an establishment Republican than the Christians really understand, and she's taken stances they should be uncomfortable with, like over-the-counter contraception, and she's been rather too comfortable with some broad exceptions for abortion. So I think her taking on Planned Parenthood was objectively a good thing, and it was politically a good thing. But I think people need to realize that she is kind of from the George Bush wing of the Republican Party, and I would not be entirely comfortable with her choosing Supreme Court justices. Ted Cruz gave a really powerful talk, and he spoke very clearly to key issues for Christian voters. Religious liberty, he emphasized just the grave threats to religious liberty that are posed because of the Supreme Court decision on same-sex marriage. And he talked about 9 cases of families that were ruined because of the immediate application of so-called equal rights for same-sex couples. And he also spoke very strongly about the need for a president to choose Supreme Court justices who have a track record of being strict constructionists, a track record of recognizing that the Constitution does not protect things like abortion and same-sex marriage. And he pointed out how we ended up with Justice Roberts and Justice Kennedy, that it was because 2 different Bush administrations were unwilling to fight. They would not pick perfectly qualified judicial candidates who had conservative track records. Instead, they picked ciphers, people whose ideology was kind of secret because they'd never taken a principled stand in their lives. Well,
John Roberts had a fairly consistent record. And again, my memory is not real clear on that, but his, at least, jurisprudence, lower courts before he was elevated to the Supreme Court, suggested that he's pretty darn conservative. And of course, one of the biggest surprises when he determined Obamacare was a tax, and then of course created a new definition for state exchange on this last case, is that it just simply didn't mirror his past jurisprudence. And the argument was, well, obviously he got leveraged once he got to the high court. And of course, Sandra Day O'Connor, that's another great example. Ken Starr used to basically justify her to the Reagan administration. Of course, Reagan had already made the promise that he was going to make the first woman Supreme Court justice. Sandra Day O'Connor was picked. Ken Starr carried the water on that. Her jurisprudence, that's a good example. It would have reflected where she was going. I mean, she was always a moderate in her approach.
Right.
And of course,
they
that
should have
proved
picked Phyllis Schlafly. She's a lawyer.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, it's the thing is, you've got to pick people that don't just have consistent jurisprudence, but also folk that have strong backbones, because you're going to be under all sorts of unseen pressure to do things. I mean, that's Roberts. It's just very, very difficult to come up with any type of logical explanation, at least from the law, for what he's done. It's not consistent with his past. There's got to be a political component to it, and that's where the integrity comes in. So who do you really think came out on top in that forum? Anybody that really, in your mind, surprised you?
Well, the funny thing, Rick Santorum surprised me. He gave a really powerful performance, and it made me think, I wish this guy were back in the Senate. I wish he had managed to keep his Senate seat in Pennsylvania instead of losing it catastrophically. So he has made some weird political decisions in the past. He's backed some squishy moderates and shown a lack of principle in those cases. But overall, I think he was very good in the Senate, and I miss his kind of populist advocacy for the working man. And I like the way he's been willing to push back against the Catholic Church, to which he and I both belong, on the issue of immigration, because the Catholic Church is being turned into a one-issue immigration lobby. The pro-life issue has been put way on the back burner, and you see Pope Francis, when he came here, did not speak about abortion in any public forum, but he talked about the death penalty and the need to welcome immigrants. So I think having Catholic politicians like Jindal and Santorum who are willing to push back against the overreach of leftists like Pope Francis is an important thing, and I kind of wish Santorum were back in the Senate.
I don't think Santorum's all bad. His rhetoric is certainly, of course, the rhetoric doesn't always meet action, but he's made some pretty powerful, I think, good, sound statements. But, of course, as many people know in Alaska, he's been historically a Murkowski supporter. He's radically pro-abortion, and he's had some other issues, too. He's been working really hard the last several years to make himself out to be this kind of Tea Party guy. But one of the things that he did in the Senate was, he's consistently supportive of leadership, even on the wrong issues, too. This is the problem that we're faced with all the time. And you have all these candidates out here. Ted Cruz, for example. I mean, my word, you talk about a guy that's articulate, that knows the issues, smart, a natural leader, you would say, for the conservative movement. And then he goes out and supports the TPA. The night before the vote, he changes it, but the damage was already done. He had the House members that basically cited his name and pushing the TPA through. And that was a big deal. I mean, that's yet another lurch toward internationalism. And, of course, you can point this out about all of them. I mean, Trump, anti-establishment candidate, but he's got a checkered past, too. I mean, every once in a while you get these candidates that are near perfect. I haven't seen one of those in a long time.
No, and we have to remember Ronald Reagan had been pro-choice back when he was governor of California. So we do have to allow room for people to develop and make mistakes and to recover from those mistakes. But when you see a consistent pattern in the wrong direction, I'm kind of concerned about Marco Rubio, because I think he would occupy the whole of Iraq. He is backed by the most hawkish neoconservatives in the Republican Party establishment, which is why they're backing him instead of Jeb Bush. Because Jeb Bush, they see, is not sufficiently interventionist compared to Marco Rubio. So I'm afraid if Marco Rubio got the nomination, we'd have a President John McCain, in effect.
Right. No, and the immigration issues, I mean, it's pretty clear these folk that they've kind of hand-selected. This is kind of in a different sphere. I mean, the House of Representatives and their leadership search, the same sort of deal. Who is actually in the back pocket of the establishment is going to move the country, continue to move the country toward bigger, more expansive federal action, more internationalism. And they've now tried Ryan. Of course, Boehner's staying on now until they find somebody else. There's even criticism about the Freedom Caucus's pick of Daniel Webster on immigration issues, although, of course, he'd be a far cry better than anybody the establishment has come up with. But
Ryan would be a catastrophe. Ryan has been a shill for amnesty for the past 20 years. He came out against Prop 187 in California. I would pick anyone over Paul Ryan. I think I'd pick a Democrat over Paul Ryan.
Well, you may end up with a Democrat because the news out today is that the Republican leadership is now in talks with the Democrats to get the leader they want because they know that the Freedom Caucus is not going to cooperate. Which, I think this is such good news. Finally, we've got people of backbone that are standing up and saying, okay, this is it. Everything's on the line. You've already taken everything you can take from us. You've stripped us of leadership. And now we're going to vote our conscience. We're going to vote what the people want. And that's limiting government. And the leadership doesn't know what to do with that. These are folk that apparently they don't have any leverage over. But I think it is finally blowing out in the open, this mirage that we've had of bipartisan approaches to various issues. Now it's the Republican leadership joining with their friends across the aisle to continue to grow government. It's hard to escape that kind of image. When you get this information out about the negotiations ongoing. Anyway, Dr. Zmirak, really appreciate you coming on the show, giving us insights about not just what Ben Carson said on the gun control issue, but also in addition to that, your perspective of the forum in Texas. Last week, we'll have you back. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Stay with us, The Joe Miller Show. More after these messages.